Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar dedicated to CSA risk-based testing. We truly appreciate you taking the time to join us today. There are still a few more people joining us, so let's wait a moment for them. In the meantime, please let me know where you are from. I'm always very curious. This webinar is recorded and will be shared with all the registrants in the following days. I hope you can see and hear me well. If there are any issues, please drop me a comment. In the meantime, let me start the presentation and share the slides.
Oh, we have a visitor from Armenia. Hello. Hi, folks from India.
As the title suggests, today's webinar will focus on computer software assurance, abbreviated to CSA, topics in the context of risk-based testing approach. I will also try to address the fundamental differences between computer system validation, abbreviated to CSV, and computer software assurance. So my intention in general is to provide some, let's say, general and maybe basic information, not going deeply into the details, as I would like to present you consistent, let's say, approach, starting from some risk-based items and finalizing in the testing rigor and testing strategy terminology. Today's webinar will be hosted by me and Jeff Ramos from Valgenesis. My name is Piotr and I have been validation lead at Millennium for a year. I have 9 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry, specializing in computerized system validation and quality assurance topics. In my free time, I enjoy riding motorcycles and spending some quality time with my family. I will be your co-host for today's session. I'm going to familiarize you with the subject by concentrating on theory. Jeff, the second co-host, will present you practical aspects using validation lifecycle management system, VLMS. Jeff, the stage is yours.
All right. Hey, folks from around the world. My name is Jeff Ramos. I am currently living here in the San Francisco Bay Area. My background is in software validation. And I'm happy to be here to present VLMS and how we can utilize risk-based approach to help with your validation needs. All right, back to you, Peter.
Thank you, Jeff. So during this webinar, we will discuss main differences between computerized system validations and computer software assurance. Next, we'll try to focus on risk-based approach and assurance activities. Next, we'll move to testing rigor, risk-based testing. Later, we will talk about classification of computerized systems. And finally, we'll focus on types of testing. The second part will be the demo presentation of VLMS system that Jeff will take over. And the last part will be QA session that will try to answer your questions that you raised on the chat during our presentation. We expect the session to last about 1 hour, followed by a QA session. During the webinar, a Q&A chat box will be available for you to leave your questions at any time. We'll answer them at the end of the webinar. We really want to hear from you, so you are really welcome to do so. Your input is really valuable for us. So let's get started with our first topic. Computer system validation and computer software assurance are both frameworks, I can call it approaches, ensuring the reliability and compliance of computer system and software, particularly in regulated industries like pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and healthcare. Both approaches play a similar role, but have some key differences I would like to talk about. CSV is quite a traditional, highly documented validation approach, while CSA focuses more on a risk-based approach to ensure software quality and compliance. The FDA released the general principles of software validation at the beginning of the 2020s, so nearly 2 decades ago. considering the significant advancements in technology since then, it's quite surprising that we still rely on guidance written almost 20 years ago to validate our software systems. One of the main goals in shifting from CSV to CSA is to bridge the gap between technology and current guidance. The most significant difference between these two methods is that CSV focuses heavily on documentation, while CSA encourages critical thinking and risk-based approaches to more effectively test software. For the past 20 years, the FDA has advised life sciences companies to take a risk-based, less burdensome approach to CSV. These guidelines are not new, what is important, but adhering to them has been challenging for many organizations. The CSA methodology supports product quality and patient safety by emphasizing critical thinking and the use of digital technologies over burdensome testing and documentation like in CSV. By streamlining the validation process, CSA can help achieve faster deployment. So what is important and what is the conclusion? CSV doesn't disappear. However, CSE, I can say, is the future and a more efficient way to conduct CSV. CSA flips the paradigm. Let's have a look at the diagram. It visually illustrates the key differences between CSV and CSA in the context of changing the proportions of key elements such as documentation, testing, assurance, and critical thinking. What I mentioned on the previous slide. As you can see, the key elements are maintained, but the effort priority has changed. So the elements still are the same, but the proportion has changed. High-level stages in implementing CSA are visible on the diagram. There are four main steps. The first one is the identification of the intended use. The next one is establishment of the risk-based approach. Next is the determination of appropriate assurance activities. And the last one, establishment of appropriate records. During my presentation, I will mainly focus on, let's say, on the second one and the third. So let's have a look on further details. The FDA acknowledges that the level of assurance required for a computerized system varies depending on the software's intended use and recommends employing a risk-based analysis to determine the appropriate assurance activities. Therefore, the rigor of assurance should be aligned with the level of process risk. Proper documentation should be maintained to demonstrate all assurance activities and confirm that the software operates as intended. So as you can see, once the software risk level increases, the testing rigor also increases. Here you can see, let's say, the main steps related and required to establish finally a testing rigor. So establishment of the testing rigor is the last step, as you can see in the diagram. But before we define the test rigor, we need to, let's say, follow some additional steps. The first one, based on my experience and available knowledge, would be to determine if the computerized system is GXP or non-GXP. So, other words, if the system is subject to health regulation. Commonly is part of the initial impact assessment, commonly completed for each computerized system. The next step is to determine the regulatory impact to establish if the impact on product quality, patient safety, or data integrity is direct, indirect, or there is no impact. The next step is to determine the complexity of a computerized system. I mean, for example, if this is a COTS system, so commercial off-the-shelf, let's say, application or custom application. So this is the meaning of complexity here. The next step is the functional risk assessment. I will go into some details later during the slides, but this functional risk assessment is, I would say, subsequent activity activity to the initial impact assessment mentioned and related to the first and second step. And the last one is the testing rigor. So once we, let's say, establish some quality aspects versus complexity of a computerized system, we can, let's say, finally determine the testing rigor. But let me explain you it better during the next slides. Diagram shows a schematic presentation, representation of a computerized system. In this case, the system can be divided into individual components that perform specific functions. I would like to briefly, let's say, define you what I mean by system component, and function, because it is really important to understand in the context of functional risk assessment and applying the risk-based approach according to CSA. So I can define system as the entire application. So commonly when you start your initial impact assessment, you assess the risk for entire system or application. So for example, it can be high, medium, or low, as you can see in the legend. System component is a modular and reusable part of the software that performs specific related functions. A component function can be defined as a specific task or operation performed by a software component. Each of the elements showing the diagram has a specific risk assigned according to the legend. So how can the risk be calculated? For example, determined based on the matrix. For example, GXP impact versus type of implementation. As output value of such risk analysis, we can get, for example, a value called overall risk. So we can say here that the more we fragment our system, the more information we will receive about the risks associated with individual system elements. And as a result, we'll be able to determine the appropriate testing rigor for them. In this way, we reduce excess testing effort, commensurate with associated risks, because we don't assume that all system components and functions have the same risk as the entire system. Risk analysis completed for the entire system I would call initial risk assessment, and determination of risk for system components and functions I would categorize as a functional risk assessment, which is a separate activity in terms of CSA deliverables and activities, as I previously mentioned. Let's jump now to the definition of, let's focus now on the benefits of the CSA risk-based testing. So as I said, the CSA in general is a less burdensome approach referring to the CSV. So it is supported by applying critical thinking that allows us to focus on high critical areas and finally increase the level of computerized system quality. So it also results in reduced testing documentation. So ultimately, we can save some time and resources. Therefore, it's not only impact on the positive impact on quality, but also on the efficiency. So now, I would like to focus on the definition of critical, let's say, thinking, because it is one of the main and one of the most important aspects of CSA, and sometimes it can be misinterpreted. So what is critical thinking? As I said, sometimes it can be not intuitive, so I will try to explain it as per the process. So in general, critical thinking is a cyclical process reducing the possibility of putting data at risk and supporting an increase in efficiency. I would describe it by 4 items. The first one would be experience. So we should stop and think instead of reacting quickly. The next one is the reflection. So we always need some time to think about the situation that we experience. The next step would be meaning. So the meaning can be derived from the previous step, from the reflection. And the last one would be action. So action can be taken based on output from previous steps, so all steps. Structural approach can be reflected by, let's say, I would say the steps like stop, think, plan, and act concept. So when we collect all of them, we can say that we, let's say, apply critical thinking in practice. Because definitions are important, but it is important to really know how to apply critical thinking in practice. So finally, from the CSA perspective, critical thinking allows effectively assessing the situation and ensuring that items are validated at a level commensurate with the risk and priority. Now let's have a look at an example of the categorization of computerized system based on the GAMP5 classification. GAMP5 is an acronym for the Guideline Good Automated Manufacturing Practices Issue 5. As you can see, there are maybe 5 categories of software and hardware according to GAMP5. Initially, I said there are 4 categories because, as you can see in the note, category 2 is not included as it has been removed from GAMP. At the moment, I don't remember exactly in which version the category 2 was excluded from which version, but in the last version, there are 4 categories. So category 1, infrastructure software. Category 3, non-configured software. Category 4, it's configured software. And category 5, it's custom software. So as I said, it's only example from GAM5, but I think it is commonly used across, let's say, software validation. That's why I wanted to show you an example of such classification. Sorry. Now let's have a look at software testing. Sorry. So software testing types can be grouped into 2 types. The first one is scripted and the second one is unscripted. It is important to note at the beginning that unscripted testing doesn't mean that test documentation is not required. I would rather say that the documentation effort is significantly lower compared to unscripted testing. We'll see this later with an example. In general, scripted testing follows a prescribed step-by-step method and is commonly used with the CSV. Unscripted testing is less time-consuming as it is based on a high-level scenario without following any specific detailed sequence of steps. CSA advises us to reserve scripted testing for high-risk features and systems. The goal of CSA is not to replace CSV or scripted testing. Sometimes this statement is misinterpreted and associated with replacing one approach with another. Rather, CSA encourages us to utilize critical thinking combined with a risk-based approach to identify the system features critical to product and patient safety, and finally focus testing efforts on really critical items. Let's jump briefly to the testing terminology. So on the slide, I have collected, I would say, the most important terminology that can be useful during this webinar. So let's have a look briefly. So the first one is the test rigor. So it is defined as the extent of testing commensurate with the risk level of particular computerized system function. So test rigor, let's say, I would say, is the purpose of our presentation. So how to determine this testing rigor. Test artifact, I would say many people can, let's say, can, let's say, connect test artifact with the test script or test case, as it is commonly, this nomenclature is commonly used in the software validation, but in general, it is a predefined object using to document execute test. Test record is like documented evidence of test execution based on the test artifact. Acceptance criteria are conditions that system component or function needs to have to meet the, let's say, user requirements. Of course, yeah, they are a really important part of, let's say, of each test, I would say, artifact, and they are defined in the test artifact. And test objectives, they are referring to specific aims or goals that a particular test is designed to achieve. I think these definitions are the most important for today's webinar purpose. The difference between scripted and unscripted testing has already been discussed by me. In this table, you can see a more detailed division of testing types, which I have prepared based on my experience and commonly used across computerized system validation area. It is also referenced in FDA guidelines. Robust and limited scripted testing differ in that limited is a hybrid approach where the test script contains both detailed steps written in a scripted manner and steps based on unscripted testing based on high-level objectives. While in the robust methodology, detailed step-by-step instruction is included. Automated tests where special testing software is used, other than software being tested, are classified as scripted tests due to the fact that often it is necessary to prepare the code, a detailed script to perform an automated test. When it comes to unscripted testing, the first group, and I think the most popular, are exploratory tests based on testers' experience. What does it mean in practice? Tester follows test steps defined in a test script, but high-level definition of steps basing on high-level objectives allows tester to explore tested item based on their existing relevant knowledge and experience. So this approach helps to uncover hidden properties, as there are multiple ways to conduct a test. Next type of testing is ad hoc testing, focusing on the verification of particular requirement where acceptance criteria are defined with low documentation effort. Still, testing date, tester's name, and results should be documented, for example, directly under requirement record like user story. Error guessing testing is quite similar to ad hoc, I would say, when it comes to the level of documentation effort, but it focuses mainly on the tester's knowledge of past failures and general understanding of failure modes. System demo is like a walkthrough of the system functionalities to verify defined requirements. Commonly, it is used to verify business requirements during UAT testing. A test case is not required in this case, but results should be concluded with the overall statement if objectives were met or not. And what is important, I have prepared, let's say, this table based on my experience and available knowledge. So let's treat it only as an example at the moment. In this table, I have summarized testing types, including also test stages commonly associated with particular test types. It should be treated as an example created based on my experience, the same as for the previous, let's say, table. And what is important to note is that unscripted testing also requires some level of testing documentation, as I explained previously. In each testing type, test records should be created, while for some of them, test artifact is non-mandatory. Regarding the test stage, SAT acronym is for system acceptance testing, and UAT is for user acceptance testing. Unscripted testing, when to use. So there are some conditions, let's say, which maybe are not mandatory, but nice to be met. So the first one would be the risk-based approach is quite well defined in the organization and commonly used for the determination of the testing rigor. So the next one is the situation when computerized system is changing, or let's say all the time through its life cycle. So it's quite a dynamic situation here, and the testing approach must be adapted accordingly to the rapid changes. So in such situation, when we decide to use scripted, really detailed documentation, it wouldn't guarantee a better quality of the system. And the last one, the testing team should be experienced enough to conduct, let's say, unscripted testing, because as I said, it is based on general high-level objectives. So let's say the experienced testing team, in my opinion, is a really important condition to proceed with unscripted testing. What are the benefits of unscripted testing? The first one, definitely, it's efficiency, because let's say we can save our time for testing activities, mainly to prepare the documentation, finally for test execution. The next one is the flexibility. So testers, let's say, do not follow defined steps, but in general, they have freedom to explore the application in a dynamic way. So they can always update the testing methodology based on real-time findings. So, and what is important, they can discover unexpected issues, because each time they can follow the other path for testing. The last one, I can mention creativity. So testers always can use their creativity and insights to uncover defects that scripted testing might miss, because during scripted testing, we mainly focus on predefined steps. But as I said, during unscripted testing, we have such a flexibility. What I would like to talk also today are unscripted exploratory test cases, because let's say sometimes it's quite confusing. What are the, let's say, main differences between scripted and unscripted test cases? I also experienced that some people think that unscripted testing means that we don't need documentation. Yes, the answer is that we need documentation, and this is example, for example, unscripted exploratory testing. So such test cases for unscripted exploratory require a similar review and approval process comparing to scripted test cases. The structure of such test cases is quite similar, but in this case, steps are not really detailed, but based on high-level objectives. I will show you later how such test case can be built. As I said, high-level objectives and acceptance criteria are required, of course, to be defined. Traceability to requirements needs to be established. And also, I mentioned that the minimum checks needed to test requirements are determined by a meaningful test, and I would say also high-level objective. As the last part of my presentation, I would like to show you a simple example of a test scenario written in a scripted limited manner, the hybrid one that I showed you in the table, to illustrate the difference between scripted and unscripted one. So here you can see an example of the test case written in a scripted manner. Probably for the people who experience some software validation, software testing, it is, let's say, really basic and simple example. But the intention of let's say this webinar for today is not go into a lot of details, but provide you a consistent approach, let's say, as I said in the beginning. So I would like to, let's say, make it more clear for you what is the real difference. So I use the example based on the hybrid approach, which is called limited scripted testing. So limited scripted testing means that there are some steps defined in a scripted manner and some steps in unscripted. So as you can see, the test title and test objectives are defined. So it is quite simple. So it is creation and approval of non-executable document in the content manager model. So I think everyone can imagine how to, let's say, complete such actions. But the question is, how many details are we going to include in our test, let's say, scenario? So in this case, it's a hybrid approach. So the first step, I mean, to meet the first part of the objective, I mean, to create a document, I used unscripted methodology. So I didn't go into the details, and I don't tell how to create a document in the content manager, but I just say that, let's say, create non-executable document in the manager module. So test, my assumption is the tester knows how to do it. So as you can see, expected result is draft of non-executable document is created. And it is mentioned as unscripted exploratory. Steps from 2 to 6 refers to the second part of the objective. I mean, this is approval of the document created in step 1. So as you can see, these steps are more detailed because they include such details like, let's say, how to proceed. The first one is to open the content manager module. The next one is to select the document, etc. So there are a lot of instructions that we could potentially avoid in unscripted testing. So it is called scripted robust here, the methodology. So in the next slide, I would like to, let's say, present you how I transform this test case to cover it fully by unscripted methodology, unscripted exploratory. So let me show you. So here you can see that step 2 replaced steps from 2 to 6 from the previous slide. So at the moment, it is, let's say, created fully in unscripted exploratory. So the step 1 is unchanged. And the last one, so approval of the document, is at the moment written in unscripted manner. So it doesn't contain the details, so I don't tell how to, let's say, approve document, but just provide a general instruction description. So my expected result is the document is approved. So it depends on the tester, let's say, how to approve this document. I mean, my assumption is that the tester knowledge allows to, let's say, complete all the steps without, let's say, detailed step-to-step instruction. And I would say this is, let's say, really important to know the difference, the real difference between scripted and unscripted, because let's say there are a lot of confusions across the validators, testers, etc. So I would say that we should start with the basic knowledge before we go into more details regarding the, let's say, the testing methodology. I have finished my part of presentation, which covers the theory. So now I'm passing the microphone to Jeff to start the demo, an example based on validation lifecycle management system. So Jeff, please go ahead.
All right, team. How's it going? How's everyone? Thank you so much, Peter, for that such a wonderful presentation. Uh, Alex, if you don't mind playing the video for me, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, so here I am in VLMS 5.0. So I'm logging in using my user ID and password. Of course, we also support single sign-on. So here, what I'm going to do now is I am going to my inventory. So if and what I'm going to do show you here is like how I came up with reasoning on how I can validate my system. So here I am going to navigate into my computer system. For example, here, let's go ahead into Aquarius DM. And here we at VLMS have this unique tool called system assessment, where it's a decision tree logic set of questionnaires that you can answer. And based on your users' answers, and based on, of course, your experience, critical thinking, you can determine different categories. For example, here I have two tests that one determines if it's GXP impact or not, and the other if it's GAMP category. Once my user have completed their answers, here you can see that the platform has determined that these are the deliverables that are needed in order to validate my system. And as you can see here, some of these content types or doc types are optional and some are mandatory. So again, we're establishing the foundation so that we don't have to over validate or under validate. We just have the right amount of validation needed. So here, I'm just going to show you an example of the release plan that I've associated with this computer system. As you can see here, as I expand, I've already defined some of my user requirements, and I'll show you later how easy I am able to create all of these requirements and test cases using our module called Design Manager. But here, as you can see, I have a set of requirements, and next to it are different levels of risk. So depending on your user, they can utilize their experience to determine the right level of risk associated against those requirements that we're trying to prove functions as expected, right? And then there are different process conditions that you can associate against those different levels of um, risk. So what I'm going to do now here is just show you like so different samples of scripted and unscripted testing that I have drafted and then which will later on create. So here is Design Manager. Design Manager is one of the newest modules here at VLMS platform. Here you can see that I'm just going to select my entity, but you can see there's different tabs. Those different tabs just correspond to different activities you can use within this module. But what's good about here in Design Manager is that each of these tabs functions independently. So you can have a team creating, developing your requirements. You have another team creating test cases, and then have another team conduct testing so that you can all work in parallel instead of say the traditional waterfall method where you have to wait until say all the requirements are complete and then all of the testing has been authored before you can execute. Here everything can work in parallel. So here is just again an example of the release plan that I've associated with this computer system that I'm trying to validate. These are all my deliverables, and then from here what I'm going to show you next is I'm going to go to sprint. So if you follow the agile methodology, we can also support that. So you can define different sprints, and then within those sprints, you can define which set of requirements you want to work on. But for now, let's go into my URS. So this is just an example. You can define whichever content type you want or not define it. What we're trying to prove here is the system functions as expected. So here is an example of some of the URS that I have drafted already. As you can see on the left side, the ID is auto-populated. So here in Design Manager, you don't have to manually type in your requirement ID, it will auto-generate it for you. Now, here is an example of me, say, authoring my requirement and just creating a user requirement manually. I can type it in, and then once I set it, you can see that my ID is auto-populated. So this is one way in which you can author it. So here you can see I'm authoring it. And just imagine if you're in a team, you can have one team say work on a set of requirements and then have another team work on another set of requirements. While they're doing that, another team can, work in parallel. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm importing a file. So this file could be a set of requirements that you've done in the past. And instead of authoring it manually, you can just upload those files. And as you can see here, I'm just importing it. If you don't need those requirements, you can easily select those that you don't need and then eliminate it. But if you notice, the ID on the left side was auto generated for you, so you don't have to worry about it. As you can see here, I'm writing not needed at this time. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to select the requirements that I want to work on. So I'm going to select this last three that we've just developed. I'm going to lock it so that it means that we can now proceed to the next phase of this activity, and then other teammates won't be able to edit it for now. So what we're going to do now is we are going to conduct the risk assessment. As you can see there from the status, pending risk assessment. So here is where the CSA, guideline comes in, where we can utilize our critical thinking and again, experience to conduct the different levels of testing required against the requirements that we just authored. So here, I'm just going to I'm going to open up my requirement. And as you can see here, I have basic FMEA that I've developed, and I can select different levels of severity, probability, and detectability. And as soon as I select those levels, you will see below there that there are different risk process associated with it and process conditions. For example, here, my combinations of low severity, probability, and high detectability yielded a low risk process with a process conditions of enforce screenshots if there are failures. So what we're doing here is we're establishing a condition that if we conduct testing against this requirement, that if it fails, that we need uh, a screenshot to support our testing. Here are more examples of process conditions against different levels of risk. And again, these are things that you and your team can brainstorm and develop and define together so that when your users answer these questions, you have a set defined process condition based on the risk levels that you and your team have established. So here, I'm just like showing you a summary of that risk level. So let's go ahead and complete the other risk assessment for the other requirements that we've selected. And again, I can't stress enough how cool this is because, like I said, you can have teams work in parallel together. So what's happening here is like I have one team member conducting the risk assessment here. And then imagine maybe another team is already developing their test cases from requirements that were already developed like yesterday or a week ago. So here you can even add justification of why you've decided to go with this specific risk so that your other teammates can understand why you've selected this specific risk level for this specific requirement. All right, one more. So as soon as we complete this one, we can go ahead into back to the design module. So here, let me just complete this one. Boom. It's just so fun to do this, in a computer system instead of manually doing this. Back in the day when I used to be a software validation engineer, we used to do everything manually, paper-based. And here, by having VLMS as a platform, you and your team can collaborate wherever you are around the world. So anyway, here are the requirements that we've authored. We've conducted risk assessment on them. And if I select that, you can see again a summary of what it looks like. So you and your team can look at it and make decisions. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to route this for approval. Of course, you can also route this for review or anything else, whatever your workflow is. And I just wanted to show you the approval process because VLMS is indeed CFR Part 11 compliant, or so that you can be assured that if you utilize our system, you'll be able to conduct it with integrity. As you can see here, it says cannot approve your own requirement because I was the author, Mark was the author. I cannot approve, of course, my own work. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to log in as my quality manager. Let's go back there, which is Quinn. And as soon as I log into Quinn, the task for requirement approval will be populated here. Quinn will have the decision to either reject or approve. If she rejects it, Mark can modify it. But now, just for the interest of time, we'll go ahead and approve this. And as you can see, C4.11, reason for editing, user ID, password. And if you want, you can also enter a comment so that everything is documented. So there we go. I'm going to go back as Mark. And as soon as I go back to Mark, you will see that those requirements are now approved. And once they are approved, I can now develop my test cases. So these test cases is where, unscripted testing, scripted testing, ad hoc, negative testing, whatever testing that you define can utilize these requirements that you've established. Again, these requirements are things that you want to create as a foundation to help determine whether the system that you are implementing functions as expected. And we're just going to develop certain different tests to help us determine if it functions as expected. For here, I'm just going to develop in ad hoc testing. Here, I'm just going to name it ad hoc D. And then from here, I can now begin connecting my requirements against my test case. So as you can see here are all the requirements that have already been approved within this entity. And I can pick and choose which ones I want to associate with different testing. You can select one, you can select several. And then as you can see, risks are associated against those testing. And just like in the requirements, when performing these or developing these test cases, you can create them manually, as you can see here. I'm just like typing in, basic descriptions, expected results, or you can also utilize import. So if you've developed test cases in the past and you just want to reuse it again and again, all you have to do is, just upload that file, and then the system will be able to read it, upload it for you. And here I'm just like matching the different headers from my spreadsheet so that the system can read it. And boom, these are all the requirements I've utilized in the past. I've imported it. And then here I'm just like selecting the ones that I think I don't need. So I'm just gonna delete those, not needed for now. And just like I mentioned earlier, you can have one team developing the requirements while another team is working on these test cases. So if you can imagine, that saves a lot of time because everything is efficient, everything is streamlined instead of waiting from one layer to the next. Again, I am going to go ahead and route this for approval onward to the next step. And again, since I am the author, I have to go back as my quality manager just for safety, right? We don't want to approve our own work. The auditors will not like that. So here we've established a way for that to be prevented. But anyway, again, here is Quinn approving my work, entering my reason for the e-signature, my user ID, and my password. Test looks good. Oh, even says great. There we go. And then as soon as I do that, let's go ahead and go back as Mark, who will now be able to utilize those tests and conduct the actual testing. Now, before we do that, let me just show you Trace Matrix. Trace Matrix is something that's very powerful within VLMS and something that we are very proud of. It's a dynamic way of tracing your requirements against your test cases. But here you can just see that everything has been approved so that we can go ahead to the trace matrix. What I like about our trace matrix is that we have several different views. But my favorite view, actually, here you can see a simple view here. is the end-to-end coverage. So the end-to-end coverage will list all the requirements you have in the system, as you can see here on the left side, and it's hyperlinked. So if you need to gain more understanding, all you have to do is select that hyperlink. But what's good is on the right side here, you can see different testings that I have. I have um, those in hyperlinks, and you can notice that there are different colors associated against those different tests that we've created. Blue means it's associated against those requirements. Green means it's already been tested and passed. And red means it's been tested but failed. So here, what I'm showing are the different requirements that we just authored. And now we can execute. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to initiate that test. I'm going to select the ones that we just approved and authored so that we can begin testing, and executing within VLMS is something that is, lifesaver, especially if you're coming from paper world. Everything is so seamless. Everything is so efficient. So here, let me just complete defining the test that I want. And as you can see here, I can select a target date because this is, of course, a task. So we have a target date, and I can actually select a specific user to whom to assign it to. I can send it to a group, or for the interest of time, I guess I assign it to myself. And here you can mimic your workflow. You can define who you want to review this work, who you want to approve it, and if there are any defects, you can even select a group of users, maybe an SME group, who can conduct the assessment to determine the course of action to mitigate those defects. But right now, what I'm going to show you is, of course, I'm going to open up this test. And then I'm just going to execute. And executing is very easy. All you have to do is go against that, that test that you want, and then enter your result. Now, as you can see there, we are testing a high risk requirement. And as you can see, since we determined that this is high risk, there are certain process conditions that we need to fulfill in order to complete the testing. And as you can see there, if I didn't complete it, I get a warning. So here, let's just go ahead and upload sample evidence. So here, let me just select sample evidence right there. I'm going to select it. And we support multiple file types, PDF, Word, PowerPoint, whatever file type you need. We support that. And as soon as I do this, you can see that it's now part of my test. Next one is, of course, I need a screenshot because that's one of my process conditions. If it's high risk, I need a screenshot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to capture a screenshot of that page. I'm going to paste it here. And on the right side there, you can see that there is an automated watermark of when I captured that screenshot. So here I fulfilled my requirements. I'm able to pass. And as soon as I do that, you can see that who executed it, when they executed it, and the time they executed it is populated there. So if you ever get audited, they can see that everything was done in sequence and nothing was manipulated. If you want to preview your evidence, all you have to do is select that hyperlink, and there you can see the type of evidence that you have conducted. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go back to the trace matrix so that you can see that every time I conduct a test within my test lab, it is automatically traced within my trace matrix. So if you have a group monitoring the different tests, they can easily go to the trace matrix and determine which tests have been done, which tests are still pending, which have failed. Now, just to wrap things up here, I'm just going to show you a sample of unscripted testing. This is one way to just simplify things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my URS, the ones that we just developed, right? And I will conduct testing directly against that requirement. So no need to develop test cases. What we're going to do is just a simple unscripted testing wherein I have my set of requirements, and then I'm just going to test directly against them to show that it functions as expected. So if you and your team have determined, like maybe if this is low risk and you can conduct unscripted testing directly against the requirements, then we can avoid other forms of documentation to prove that it functions as expected. And here you can see that I can just conduct testing directly against that requirement. No need to conduct or create ad hoc testing or uh, scripted testing to support that. And just like earlier, all we have to do is enter our actual results, pass. And since this is low RPN, our process condition didn't require us to provide any other samples. So basically that is, oh, here, I'm just showing you like if I wanted to update it, I can easily update it. But since we've already executed this test and we're modifying it, we need the reason why we're editing it. And here, I'm just going to show you um, how you can easily compare different versions. And as you can see here, left and right, you can see the old value and the new value, and it's also crossed out. So again, auditors love to see if it's been modified, the old value is still there so that they can determine that everything was not manipulated. Anyway, that is a very high level overview of our platform. Of course, 20 minutes is not enough to go deep into this, but if you have any questions or interest, feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to set up a demo. Passing it back to you, Peter.
Thank you, Jeff. So let's jump to Q&A session and let me answer your questions. I will read your questions aloud. So the first one is, can we continue to test more rigorously than is required by the determined testing rigor? I would say yes. Sometimes there are some conditions that make us to apply more rigoristic, let's say, testing than defined by our functional assessment. So I would say that we define the minimum testing rigor by our, let's say, risk assessments. The next one is how exploratory testing can be utilized for SAT and UAT. I assume that it has to be used when we would like to explore the system or to identify gaps, while SAT and UAT are more for definitive purpose. So I would say that SAT, system acceptance testing, and UAT, user acceptance testing, are test stages. So both of them refers to, let's say, different types of requirements. So SAT refers to functional requirements mainly, and UAT to user requirements. So I would say the exploratory is, let's say, how we perform, let's say, our testing. So for exploratory, as I said during my presentation, we have to define the objective and acceptance criteria. And I would say we can use, let's say, exploratory testing in the same way for SAT or UAT, but in general, we test different requirements. And of course, if we follow exploratory methodology, we always explore some let's say, areas of the system because the steps are not predefined. Is CSA, and the next question, is CSA applicable to all levels of category, including GAMP 5? Is there any limitation? So in the presentation, I showed you, let's say, 4 categories. And so the first one was infrastructure software, the next one non-configured software, configure software, and custom software. So I would say, let's say in general, CSA is applicable to software. So the same areas which are covered by CSV are, I would say, covered also by CSA. So I would say that all types of software that I mentioned are covered by CSA, because it doesn't provide, let's say, a requirement that we need to start using, let's say, risk-based approach. This is not new approach. So it was already established by CSV. It's like the refreshment, I would say. So in general, I would say yes, all system categories are covered by GAMP categorization. Next question, is unscripted testing widely used in the industry? Hard to say. Based on my experience and my, let's say, projects, it depends on the situation. Yeah, but I would say that a lot of projects still follow the old traditional
Yeah.
CSV methodology and robust testing. So as I said, hard to say. But let's say the intention of CSA is to change the proportion and to, let's say, make, let's say, using, let's say, unscripted testing more often, I would say.
Yeah. Actually, in my past life, when I was in software development, we used a lot of unscripted testing to prove that the functions, enhancements, or new features that we are developing functions as expected. We don't need super rigorous testing to test those, just to see if it functions as expected. And that's what we're trying to bring in the life sciences industries. We don't need super detailed testing to prove it functions as expected, just provide enough to um, ensure that you are what the software intends to do is functioning as you expect it to do.
Thanks, Jeff. And last question, does CSV support risk-based approach same as CSA? So as I said, risk-based approach is the new concept. So in general, CSA and CSV support risk-based approach. I would say that CSA, let's say, advise us to use critical thinking and, let's say, using risk-based approach more efficiently. So I would call it this way. This was the last question. So thank you, everyone. I think that's all for today. So thank everyone for joining today's webinar. I remind you that in the coming days, let's say, you will receive an email notification with this webinar recording, and see you in some time in during next webinars, hopefully.
Millennium. IT for people. People for IT.